Hey, I'm Frenchie from Insignia Security, and I'm here to talk to you today about software supply chain security. So today we'll talk about a bit of a brief history, some useful definitions I think that will cut through a little bit of the noise because it's a little bit spammy in the space at the moment. Current state, bit of a demo of some cool things that we've found, and what's next. So first, I want to play a game. Who am I? Literary genius. 1984 was a pretty important year, and I painted this bleak and dystopic picture that people would leave my works thinking about pretty dismissed about the future of humanity. I am, of course, Reflections on Trusting Trust, the seminal paper by Ken Thompson, written in 1984. It's the stuff that everyone in the software supply chain security space references, and frankly, the stuff of nightmares. Now, if you don't know who Ken is, he's what we refer to as a bit of an underachiever. He wrote the original Unix operating system, the foundation of pretty much all modern OSs today. You heard of C programming language? Yeah, he wrote B, the precursor, the one that came before that. If you ever used grep, thanks, Ken. Go. That was Ken again. Now, Ken was and is today an absolutely prolific open source developer. I'll let the audience decide whether or not we think that teaching sand how to think was a good idea, but in my opinion, the entire field of computing and humanity as a whole has really benefited from his contributions. Now, this paper, if you're in tech at all and you're particularly interested in security, you have to read this paper. In fact, if you haven't, stop right now, pause this video, actually go find the tab that's playing audio, pause the video, stop it, and go and read the paper right now. Seriously, it's only 3 pages. I'll wait. It will completely evaporate all trust you have in computers. I'm waiting. Great, welcome back. Now, the only downside with this great piece of work is that it took until 2023 for anyone to actually properly understand it. And I'm only partially joking. It took until 2023 for someone to actually get the source code. It's crazy. No one had ever asked Ken. Russ Cox, who worked with Ken at Google on the Go project, emailed him. And maybe it took that long for someone who Ken actually trusted to ask, but it took that long. And now that we have that source code, Russ wrote a phenomenal blog post and actually did a modern version of this in Go. I'd highly, highly recommend reading that paper. In short, what it was a quine. Now, a quine is a piece of code that, when executed, produces its own source code as an output. It's a bit of a mind flip, but it was a fun challenge back in the day. And when compiled, it produces its source code completely. Now, Ken's little trick specifically was that he would change it so it would maliciously introduce a bit of a backdoor into whatever was produced. In his case, it was a login prompt, so that he would backdoor any login prompt that was compiled to accept a backdoored password that only he knew. Now, the brilliance of Ken was that he used this to produce a compiler, which anything further produced from that compiler would also be backdoored. Now, maybe you want to try and detect this, and you want to run a debugger at runtime. Well, you can't trust that, because what if it was compiled by that compiler? Or a disassembler to reverse engineer it statically? Nope, no dice. In fact, if any tool was ever poisoned by this compiler, they can be tampered with too. You can read the code all you like, run as many tools, hire the smartest security engineer you know. That compiler is what's injecting the backdoor. It's effectively a logical dead end for all software security. And the best part is this was from early on in the days of computing. Now, in this paper, he made it very clear that it was purely theoretical, and he'd used the paper to get a moral stance against the malicious crackers of the day. But he also mentions that he got the idea from an earlier document, an unknown Air Force document. It was released even earlier. Now, cut forward to today, we know 2 things. We know that paper, the Multic Security Evaluation, is declassified, was released in June 1974, a whole 10 years earlier. And we know that it wasn't theoretical. Ken had already launched what was the first software supply chain security attack in real life back in '74. Which puts us about here on the history of all operating systems. And I quote here is that he enticed the Unix support group at Bell Labs to pick up a copy of his backdoored compiler. This group and some of the others that he compromised worked on the foundations of what evolved into every modern operating system ever. Linux, BSD, Solaris, Mac, all of them. The Unix support group grabbed a copy of this backdoored compiler and unsuspectingly they used it until someone noticed a tiny bug, an off-by-1 error. It was an extra null byte that when it was added to the compiler when it can recompile itself, it just got 1 byte bigger at each time. And because the file size grew, they picked it up and then they found this compiler and it was replaced. Or so we think. How would we ever know if Ken had backdoored more systems? After all, his paper demonstrated that it is just categorically impossible for us to ever know. It reminds us of vintage steel a little bit. How steel manufactured before 1945 and the dropping of the atomic bomb was incredibly valuable for scientific instruments that require the lowest possible radiation, because all steel after 1945 is just poisoned, tampered. Has a little bit too much background radiation. This event grew in infamy in computing circles and is known simply as the Ken Thompson hack, or KTH, the point at which building trusted software has just fundamentally changed forever. Now, I love that story and I'll take my tinfoil hat off a little bit. The likelihood of Ken having the forethought to backdoor modern systems in 1974 is incredibly, incredibly low. Probably didn't happen. But the moral of the story is a powerful one and bears repeating today. You can't trust code that you did not totally create yourself, especially from code from companies that employ people like Ken. So that's it. Mission accomplished. Just don't use any software you haven't created yourself. Clearly, no more open source software. Done. Well, that obviously hasn't been how things have played out. We need to think of open source software as a common good, like the air we breathe. We all stand on the shoulders of giants and we're better off as a result. In terms of trusted software, however, I believe that the creativity of open communities will prevail. And we can and are building software systems around these limitations. We still use computers today 50 years later, so things aren't completely broken. Now, let's jump to today. And to understand what is and isn't working, I think there's a lot about software supply chain security, and there's happening at the moment, and there's a new acronym almost every single week. I think to understand it, we need to unwrap some of this alphabet soup. Now, there are valuable tools and standards out there, absolutely, but you've probably heard of SBOM, SALSA, GWOC, NIST, SSDF, and so on. Now, all these acronyms I just listed are great, but they're also getting lost amongst the new permutations of new kid on the block BOM. Personally, I just don't like acronyms. And I know that Australians have a stereotype of being quite crude, so I'll let you know that I refer to these as F-bombs. I think to give us some clarity here, I want to reference Russ Cox again. He had a great keynote back at ACM scored in 23. And a workshop specifically, it was focused on software supply chain security, offensive research, and ecosystem defenses. He asked us 2 simple and very pertinent questions, which I think we should reflect on. What is software supply chain? And what does it mean to be secure? Now, on the first, he used a good definition from Kim Zeta. The supply chain attack is the nefarious alteration of trusted software before delivery. Cool. I think that helps us a lot. And then on the other hand, he also classified things, to break it down a little bit, between vulnerabilities and attacks, which I think if we talk about SolarWinds, for example, right? Malicious supply chain attack ultimately impacted a closed source system, but it was, as you know, super high profile, impacted 18,000 systems, right? It was an attack. On the other hand, Log4Shell, that was a supply chain vulnerability, not maliciously introduced into open source, but it was highly used and prolific and very painful to patch, right? So attack and vulnerability helps us break out some of this noise. And then the other direction in terms of understanding the software supply chain is understanding how these attacks and vulnerabilities come into play. So you've probably all seen a slide like this around the SCLC. And at the moment, we seem to be rabbit-holing down what the dependency is. This open source dependency. Well, I need to look into what that is. But when you think about your dependencies, they'll have their own process like this as well, and how they produce and build and package their own software. And the same for theirs, and their transitive dependencies, and all the way down. It's turtles all the way down. Now, this is a place where SBOMs are incredibly useful. just like a nutrition label that tells us the ingredients, it gives us the ability to understand what's in our software sausage. The open source hackers have given us a couple of really good options here in terms of standards. CycloneDX from OWASP and SPDX from Linux Foundation. Now, there's lots of great tooling around both. Generating SBOMs is now easier than ever, and Alan Friedman can finally sleep at night. The other category, not just vulnerabilities, is also attacks, which apply to that previous nested transitive dependency issue as well. But just a day or two, there was another one. Lazarus Group hit PyPy, North Korean attackers with some different packages that apply to crypto. I can't even keep the slide up to date. There's new ones coming out every single day. One extension onto what Russ talked about, which I'd like to add in, is what the SALSA framework provides, which is a distinction between source threats, build threats, and dependency threats. I think breaking it out into slightly different categories helps us break up a lot of this alphabet soup in the noise. In either case, whether it's open source software or closed source software, the final build product is ultimately impacted by the vulnerabilities and attacks that apply to this entire ecosystem. So, what does it mean to be secure? Now, Ross also talks about 3 different categories here: understanding, strengthening, and monitoring your software supply chain. Understanding is providing a baseline, really getting to the crux of where you are currently, and that's where standards like SALSA can be useful. Strengthening, filling those gaps in and improving in areas where you're not there. And then once you've reached that minimum standard of where you want to be, ensuring continuous compliance by monitoring things like, hey, a public certificate transparency log. That's what it means to be secure within software supply chain. So with those 2 things, what is software supply chain and what does it mean to be secure? What's our current state today? Well, a lot of the vendors in the space will paint a pretty bleak picture. Chicken Little, sky is falling, all open source software is hot trash. I gotta say I disagree. To those that are dunky on open source, saying that the software sausage is past its use-by date, which is where I got the title from this talk, that expiration date, if it existed, is in 1974. We're well past that. So today we're seeing an uptick of malicious activity, yes, and a big increase of reported vulnerabilities, CVEs, also yes. But the solution here isn't to try and close Pandora's box or to wait for a time machine to go back to before 1974. That's not possible. So we're going to have to rely on building trust from diverse sources. One problem that we get with this greater visibility is also more CVEs. We're also seeing a lot more junk vulnerability because of this visibility that we now have. A great tool here, and shout out to PD, thanks for putting on this conference, is the recently released CVE map tool, which helps a lot to weed through that jungle of different CVEs of noise around this and help understand it. Another tool is the OpenSSF scorecard, which I'll demo in just a sec. That's a baseline of different qualitative checks on different repos that you can run. So I'll jump over to my terminal and run this demo for a sec. So here I've got a open source project here that I want to run. SolarWinds Orion SDK. Never heard of it before. Want to see if there's any known vulnerabilities, for example. So I'm going to run a SBOM scanner here. Gripes, just one. There's heaps out there. Runs a scan and tells me, hey, 0 vulnerabilities. Sweet, we're good to go. Must be a great project. Well, I remember something about SolarWinds. I can't quite put my finger on it. So let's run some other checks maybe. So CVE map, right? Let's dig into that. So SolarWinds, I'll just check scan for the vendor SolarWinds and see what comes up. And oh, damn, okay, right. There's quite a few criticals in this. Okay. Maybe now bugs are fine. I write buggy code. Everyone writes buggy code. That happens. But maybe I want to dig a little bit further into understanding the quality of this particular repo before I use it. So I'll run another tool, scorecard, as I mentioned, and point out this repo. And it's going to run a series of checks here. Now, these here will provide a baseline across a bunch of different things, branch protection rules, whether the project's well maintained or not. And you can see the results spew out here. At the top, right, aggregate score, 3.9 is a little bit low. Let's dig into why that might be. Branch protection enabled. Interesting, okay. So that means that anyone may be able to just force push and maliciously introduce some changes or dependencies into that. I could see that being a pretty bad thing for SolarWinds. just on the off chance. What else we got? Fuzzing 0, okay, yeah, that can be hard, not super maintained. What about the security policy? Okay, that's an easy one that I can check in the UI, which would make a good demo. So let's jump over to a browser and just look at this repo here, just on GitHub. And yeah, I can see here, look, no security policy detected. Maybe that's something that they might want to introduce. I don't know, just in case a vulnerability is ever found in SolarWinds. So that's a quick way that you can show using a series of different open source tools for how to gain some trust around the projects that you're using currently. Now, to put a pin in the we can't trust open source software because we don't know who wrote it debate, standing on the shoulders of giants like Ken is a good thing. Meanwhile, CIS's known exploited vulnerabilities, a list of every active exploited vulnerability that has real-world impact right now, 90% of that comes from closed source. Every company on the planet, 99 is the number that I hear banded around, everyone uses open source software, but 90% of the vulnerabilities come from closed source. The case is pretty clear here. This is a closed source problem that companies have to solve, not from open source. Thankfully, tooling here can help us. So what are the possible solutions that closed source companies have? This is unfortunately a real quote I got from a friend that works in a highly sensitive environment. It's concerning, right? I think the current state can be summarized something like this. Now, don't get me wrong, I did incident response for Log4j and it absolutely sucked. Once the bug was known, however, thousands of developers and security people around the world all worked really, really hard to patch and keep their users safe. Hard work that I think deserves to be celebrated. It's easy to panic in the moment because of the state of things, but I think a level-headed approach to solving these problems and not panicking is what we need. When you're going through hell, keep going. I think actually the response is ultimately we've learned a lot from it and can be a positive thing. So what's next? Where do we go from here? I think it's okay for us to acknowledge that we have an issue here, while still also being optimistic around how we can solve for it. That's why I founded Insignia. Given that 90% of Kev issues are closed source, the gap here is clearly on the closed source side. Companies need to step up. Open source communities can and already are making great headwinds in this space. Now, companies need to be proactive. Sure, there's regulatory changes coming top down that they need to care about. It's going to force them, potentially, depending on their industry. The executive order here in the US, Cyber Resilience Act in the EU, Security of Critical Infrastructure Bill in Australia, just to name a few. But companies shouldn't wait until regulatory changes come and scramble when it's already too late. Now, remember from this slide from earlier? Us as private companies, we need to remember that we're part of this ecosystem as well that consume open source software. We forget that as much as we want to inspect the open source software supply chain of our dependencies, we're also in the ecosystem of our customers. And we provide that guarantee up to them, that trust. We're kind of solving it at the moment by signing contracts to accept the risk away, third-party vendor security checklists, and that, hey, industry secret, no one will admit that they're always just a little bit optimistic, just enough to get past sales or auditing or whatever. Now, sure, we might sign a contract with vendor X that says, yes, we absolutely will patch this critical vuln within 24 hours, but how do we verify that? How do our customers verify that of us? And if we invest the hard work in making a great security team and culture that provides that as an ongoing basis, how do we communicate that trust out to our customers as a competitive advantage? So what's next? Well, for companies, wherever you are on the spectrum of what does it mean to be secure, just look to mature, level up. Understand your current baseline, strengthen your weak areas, and then once you've achieved the desired level of maturity, keep going. Continuously monitor that and provide that on an open transparency log. That'd be awesome, so that others can independently verify that in the open. We've also seen huge companies like Apple making trust and privacy a core advantage for them. Device lockdown mode and blocking ad tracking, for example. And just 2 days ago, there was another executive order that bans the sale of private data overseas in the States. Now, this is something I think we can all learn from and doing things more in the open. So to recap, brief history, we talked through the Ken Thompson hack, OG software supply chain security hack, and what's old is new again. Useful definitions of software supply chain, attack versus vulnerability, but also that source, build, and dependency track that hopefully makes a little bit more sense. The current state of where things are, and a demo of some of the tooling that we can use today, some of the great open source tools. And then what's next? An overview of where I think the onus lies is actually not on a lot of the companies to be proactive and stay ahead of the competition. So what can we do? Well, for individual hackers wanting to level up their knowledge, highly recommend this book. It's on the Manning Early Access Program. Now, to get a preview of this book being written, you can sign up when it comes out. For everyone else, I highly recommend it. There's an entire chapter on thinking like an attacker. BugCrowd and other bug bounty programs are paying out pretty well for software supply chain security bugs, so level up your skills. And then separately, if you want to get more broadly involved for either companies or individual contributors, Insignia is a proud member of the Open Source Security Foundation, and I definitely recommend getting involved. With that, feel free to hit me up while Twitter or X is still around. It's my handle, or shoot me an email. Here's some of the source. Thanks so much for listening.